Go.
Okay, so our new series is James and Galatians together. I just want to see a show of hands. Who loves the book of James? Who loves the book of James? Yeah? Who loves the book of Galatians? Okay, who loves both? Who's got both hands up? Yeah? Yep, I love both of these books. So we're calling this series James and Galatians, It Takes Two to Gospel. Okay, I came up with a bit of a logo last night and I sent it to David Ashrick. David, I've taught Galatians with him in a Sabbath school before, and I know he loves Galatians. He's taught on it in the last 2 years. I think he's done 2 series. He was just messaging me a week ago asking for, what was that point you made on Galatians? And I sent it to him. He's like, oh yeah, that's it, brilliant. And so I know he loves it, so I just sent him my logo and he said, I love it. You know, I like it.
I was thinking, when you put it out, I went, I bet David would love this.
Yes. So I just was I was playing around with it last night. Have a look on my Facebook, or I can show you later the image for it. It's a really funky logo. I just like that idea that it takes two to gospel. And we're going to be looking at, for those of you who raise your hands loving both of them, you're actually a little bit in the minority in the Christian world, because there's a lot of people who see a bit of a contrast or a contradiction between James and Galatians. Has anyone heard about that?
Yeah.
Only from me? Well, Martin Luther famously called the letter of James, he called it, does anyone know what he called it?
Shouldn't be in the Bible.
Well, he called it an epistle of straw. He called it an epistle of straw. And it was classed in what he called the anti-legomenon. It was the books that he found disputed. And there is a bit of a history behind that, and we want to look at this, because if Martin Luther questioned the veracity of the book, you know, maybe we've got to look at why he did and why we can have faith and confidence in it. He eventually did, accept it as part of the canon, but it was part of the grey area of the canon in Luther's term. So we want to look at these two books because they do appear at face value on a surface reading to say some almost opposite things. And so we're going to do an overview today of these books, put them in their context historically, put them in a context literarily, and then we'll start unpackaging first James and then Galatians over the next 6 months. Does that sound like a good fun little project?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, let's look at James to begin with. Okay, so James, there's 4 Jameses in the Bible, and tradition tells us who this James is, but I'll run through the Jameses. There's James the son of Zebedee. Everyone know him? James the son of Zebedee, one of the sons of thunder. That's John's brother. John, the gospel writer and the letter writer. His brother's name was James. He was the first martyr out of the 12 apostles, the first of the apostles to die. And he died very early, around the year 44 AD. So it's unlikely that it was his that it's his letter. There was another James among the 12 disciples called James the Less, the son of Alphaeus. And it's unlikely that it was him because of just where he was situated and what he was doing. There was also another James who was the father of one of the disciples, and then there was James the brother of Jesus. And James the brother of Jesus is who history tells us wrote this letter. And James the brother of Jesus is a very interesting character. In fact, let's just say something about the name James. James is not the name in the Greek or in the Hebrew. James is the word, the transliteration that comes to us through several sources. So in the Hebrew, it would be Yaakov. So Jacob, it would have been Jacob. And then the Greek was Jakobos, and then it went to Latin, and then through early French, and then it became James. So it's actually, the name James is the name Jacob. So that's his actual name, is Jacob. So this is the book of Jacob, the letter of Jacob, not the letter of James. We just, through tradition, through the Latin and the French, we've come to the name James, and so we kind of use that. But it's really just the name Jacob. And so there were 4 of these Jacobs in the New Testament period, and the one that, the brother of Jesus, I won't give too much away straight away because I want to look at how he parallels with Paul in a moment, but he was at the head of the church at Jerusalem after Peter kind of started to go around and do things. He kind of became the pillar. Paul calls him the pillar, one of the pillars of the faith in Jerusalem. So that's James. And then you've got Paul. Paul is the author of Galatians, and we know he doesn't need a lot of introduction. His name, the Latin name is Paul. Does anyone heard the idea that Jesus changed his name from Saul to Paul? Has anyone heard that claimed? That's not in the Bible. Jesus didn't change his name. Paul was just the Latin, similar to what we're seeing with James and Jacob. Paul was the Latin of Saul. So it's just when it's in the more Latin areas, the more Roman areas, the Bible calls him Paul, but his name is actually, it's the same name. That's interesting. So he didn't actually have his name changed, but they both have two names handed down to us: James and Jacob, Paul and Saul. They both have this dual name. I thought that was quite interesting, and there's many more things. But Paul was a person who wrote many letters in our Bible, and Galatians is probably the first one. So let's talk about the timing of these letters, and the context into which they were written. So if you look at James chapter 1, verse 1, we'll just see how he starts his letter. He starts his letter by saying, James, a bondservant or a slave or a servant you might have. The actual meaning of the word is slave. We tend to kind of filter that down, like dilute the meaning, because slave seems really... There's a lot of context that we have, politically, socially, that we want to kind of say, let's say bondservant. Well, this actually just means a slave. It's just the way that they would say a slave. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. So James is writing to a mostly what audience? Jewish, Hebrew audience. It's not Jewish. Jews were one of the 12 tribes. He's writing into 12 tribes. But did the 12 tribes exist still? What happened in history to the different tribes? So after Solomon, what happened to the 12 tribes? After Solomon was king, his son Rehoboam was a bit of an arrogant sort, and he pushed away 10 of the tribes. They started their own kingdom. So you had 10 tribes over here, and you had 2 tribes here, which was Benjamin and Judah. And then the Assyrians came, several hundred years later, the Assyrians came and carried off the 10 tribes and scattered them through the nations. Scattered them. Did they ever come back? Are they ever recorded as having come back to Israel? Very few of them did. So when he's writing to the 12 tribes, he's writing a term that is very curious in a New Testament context, because there were no identifiable Naphtalites and Zebulonites and Issacharites. These were people who had been scattered so thoroughly that they were diluted through the nations you couldn't tell. But he's using this terminology, I think, for a dual reason, because I think, and we will look at this as we go through Paul's writings, there was this idea and there's this understanding that the gathering of Israel was to come as a messianic promise. We see that in places like Isaiah 11 and 12. If any of you are on my Isaiah studies on a Monday night, we're going to be touching on that very soon. So this gathering of the scattered remnants of God's people through the nations, if you've so scattered Israel, the tribes of Israel, through the nations, you can't distinguish them from the nations that they're scattered in. And so this 12 tribes, there's an idea that this might also at least hint, even if it's not in James's mind, in God's mind, it's not just to the Hebrews, because the Hebrews are so scattered through the nations that anywhere where they have been scattered, it could be Israel. It could be Israel. So is this to us today? Well, let's look at this. Some say this is only to Jewish Christians, and because there's not a lot of Jewish Christians, James is irrelevant. Well, we're going to challenge that as we go. The book of Galatians, let's go to Galatians and have a look at how that starts. And Galatians is written, he starts this in chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead, and all the brethren who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Okay, churches of Galatia, or as you might say, have in Galatia. So this was written into a geographical area. James was writing not to a specific church. He was writing an encyclical letter, we would say. It was a letter that was, okay, you read it, and then when you're done, you pass it on to the next one, you pass it on to the next, or copy it and pass it on. James was written to the people in the dispersion, the people in the diaspora. He was writing to people who had been scattered from Jerusalem. Now we remember that if you're reading Acts, when did the believers in Christ among the Hebrews, the Jewish people, when did they start to scatter? When did they begin to scatter from Jerusalem?
70 AD.
No, not 70 AD. The stoning of Stephen.
Stoning of Stephen.
Yeah. The stoning of Stephen. When they started to be persecuted, they started to scatter through Samaria and throughout the region. And so what James is doing is he's writing into the scattered people around, so to give them encouragement and hope. Paul is doing a similar thing. He's writing into the churches of Galatia. We'll have a look at what that means in a moment, because now we'll talk about the timing of these two. Now, there's something that is very important to... Let's kind of limit when these could be written. So it's James, the brother of Jesus. James, the brother of Jesus, died in about 62 AD, at a time where there was a changeover in the governance of Jerusalem by the Romans. They used that opportunity to stone James, the brother of Jesus, to death. They used it to kill him because there was a changeover of and in that period they're like, let's get him. And so he was stoned to death. So it couldn't be written later than 62 AD. And he didn't seem to rise to prominence within the Jerusalem church until the mid-40s, if you're looking at the Acts timeline and the timeline that we see. So it's between the mid-40s and the late 60s. And Galatians is probably the earliest. Now, I used to think that the Thessalonian letters were the earliest, and there's a real reason for that I'll get into in a moment. But Galatians is actually the first of Paul's letters as we look at how he's writing into this situation, which would make it in the 40s. Now, I believe both of them precede what is known as the Council of Jerusalem. Has anyone heard the Council of Jerusalem? It's the council in Acts chapter 15 where they got together to discuss, what do we do about these Gentile believers coming in? Do they have to be circumcised or not? And the fact that neither James nor Galatians references the outcome of that council, which would be very important in terms of the context of how to deal with the growing church, indicates to me that they're probably before that. So both of these letters appear to be from the mid to late 40s. Now we can put Galatians to a little bit more of a timeline. Now, has anyone got maps in the back of your Bible? Has anyone got any maps in the back of your Bible? Now, this is Turkey. This is the area of Turkey. Okay, now there's two Galatians. Okay, there's the ethnic Galatia, and then there's the provincial or political region known as Galatia. So ethnic Galatia was the area at the top part, the mid to the top part of Anatolia. Anatolia is where Turkey is. And so the ethnic Galatians, the Galatians were people of Gaelic background who had settled in the area of Turkey. Gaelic or Celtic. So people the majority of the Gaelic or Celtic people are dispersed among France and into the British Isles. And so the ethnic Galatians that were living within Anatolia were in the northern part. But if you have a look here, can you see that orange? Can you see the orange there? It goes from north down to south. So this was the political province that the Romans had carved out and said, that's Galatia. So it included part of ethnic Galatia, but it also extended all the way to the south part of Anatolia. And so the question is Paul writing to the northern ethnic Galatians, or is he writing to the provincial political designation of the Galatians? Well, it affects the timing of when this letter was. And I originally thought it was to the ethnic Galatians, but there are reasons to think that it's not, because Paul, he writes with he was a Roman citizen, and he writes, there's a pattern through his letters that and also through Acts, where he refers to things by the Roman designation more than he would by the ethnic designation. Ethnicity is not as important. He's writing into a Roman mindset, because that's the citizenship he has. And so we see, if you have a look at your map, you'll see some cities in there. Antioch in Pisidia, there's Iconium, there's Lystra, and there's Derbe. These were places that he had visited in his first missionary trip that was in the, about 47, 48 AD. So the idea is, if you're looking at the way that Galatians is written, it appears he's writing to places he's already been to. Because he's talking about, I know you guys, how are you so foolish that you've abandoned the things I taught you when I was with you? So if you're looking at the ethnic Galatians, he couldn't have done it until the 50s. He couldn't have written it until the 50s. But if it's to the political Galatians, he wrote it much earlier, in the 40s, in the late 40s, before the...
About
Paul.
Yeah, I've heard it's come up in my Bible, the whole track.
Yes, yeah, you've got a missionary trip there, yeah. Yeah, you'll see the cities on his first missionary journey, and he's writing to those in between the first and second missionary journeys, which the second journey happened after the Council of Jerusalem. So I know I've been talking a lot about history and geography, but the important thing is that these two letters, if I'm right, and the hypothesis is very strongly supported by the evidence, they're both written between 45 and 49 AD. So they're the earliest letters we have. And they're before there was this council that came together to discuss the issue of how do we integrate Gentiles and Jews into this new Christian church. And so that's really fascinating in the development of the church to look at this, because they're prior to the decision that was made, and they give us that window in how the church was forming, how it was growing, how it was blossoming from a seedling that happened during Jesus' ministry. Isn't that interesting? So when we're looking at these, we're going to see that there is some difference in how they articulate things. So I want to talk about now. I've got these as a handout if you want at the end. There's a bit of a primer on James and Paul. So I'm just going to have a look. I've got these comparisons. So James, or Jacob, in his letter, and Saul and Paul in his letter. So it's in their life, and this specifically this letter of James and the letter of Galatians. Now, James actually wrote another letter that we have in our Bible. He didn't just write the book of James. Does anyone know where the other letter is?
Philemon.
Sorry?
Philemon.
No, that was Paul. Paul wrote Philemon. No, James actually has a recorded letter in Acts 15. In Acts 15, James wrote the letter that was the decision that was handed down by the council. James actually wrote that. So you get to see another small letter from James in our Bible. So here's some interesting things. James was counted as an apostle, but he wasn't one of the 12. Paul is an apostle, but he wasn't one of the 12. Isn't that interesting? Here's another parallel. James actually sought to detain or arrest Jesus one time. Does anyone know when James tried to arrest Jesus? We actually looked at it in Mark when we were going through Mark. When they came and they said, oh, he's crazy, let's go and... the word is actually arrest and detain. They tried to arrest or detain Jesus. Remember his family said, he's crazy, let's get him and take him back to Nazareth and lock him up, and he's crazy. But look at all the things he's doing. The word is arrest. So James tried to arrest Jesus. Paul tried to arrest the followers of Jesus. James initially rejected the Messiah, Jesus as the Messiah. If you read John chapter 7, it tells about how his brothers didn't accept him as the Messiah. And Paul obviously did not accept Jesus as the Messiah initially. So both of them rejected Jesus as the Messiah. But both of them were converted by a resurrection appearance by Jesus. Yes, by a post-resurrection appearance by Jesus. James was converted. We read this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where it talks about all the people Jesus appeared to. James is one of those listed. He appeared to James, and then he appeared to the 11. So he's one of the people who was obviously converted by seeing his brother resurrected. And Paul, of course, was converted by the resurrected Jesus who appeared to him on the road to Damascus. Now, their first extant letter that they wrote was from the late 40s AD. We've just talked about that. Both of them call themselves slaves of Jesus. Bondservants or slaves. James has a gospel evangelism with a Jewish emphasis, while Paul has a gospel evangelism with a Gentile emphasis. Come to Galatians chapter 2 for a second, because this is important. There are some who say that there are different gospels, that there are two different gospels here, that James has a one version of the gospel and Galatians has another. Well, first of all, go to Galatians chapter 1. Actually, let's start in Galatians chapter 1. Wait while I turn there. So Galatians chapter 1, Paul is saying that there is only one gospel. He says, I marvel that you are turning away so soon, this is in verse 6, from him who called you to the grace of Christ to a different gospel, which is not really another, but there are some who trouble you and want to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel to you than what we have preached to you, let him be accursed. I'll say it again. If anyone preaches another gospel to you other than what you have received, let them be accursed. So Paul is very... does he mince words here? He says, if what I've preached to you, if the gospel you've received from me, if you hear anything else, if someone else is preaching something different to what I'm preaching, let him be cursed. So if James really has a different gospel to what Paul is preaching in Galatians, what should James be? Cursed. He shouldn't be in our Bible. Get the scissors out, cut that thing out. But come to chapter 2 and let's look from verse 6. So this is talking about Paul has gone to visit the brethren in Jerusalem. It included Peter and James. From those who seem to be something, whatever they were, it makes no difference to me. God shows no personal favoritism to any man. For those who seem to be something added nothing to me. That's talking about the leaders in Jerusalem. It says, but on the contrary, when they saw that the gospel for the uncircumcised had been committed to me, as the gospel for the circumcised was to Peter, for he who worked effectively in Peter for the apostleship to the circumcised also worked effectively in me toward the Gentiles. And when James, Cephas or Peter, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. So interesting here, it's not two gospels he's talking about. He's already told you in chapter 1, there isn't two gospels. He's not saying that there's one gospel that goes to the Gentiles and one goes to the Jews. It's the same gospel that goes to the Gentiles and to the Jews. They're just delineating dividing the labour between them. It's the same gospel though. So it's not a different one. So it's just a different emphasis. It's just a different way that it's going to play out for the Jews and the Gentiles. Here's another thing. They both condemned partiality when the believers were assembled. We're going to see that. James speaks about how you're not supposed to have partiality to the rich people among you or to the people who seem to be something. And we just saw Paul saying that it means nothing to me where someone comes from. Paul actually rebukes Peter, as we'll see, for sitting with the Gentiles until some of the Jews come, and then he goes and sits only with the Jews. In fact, I want to have the Lord's Supper that day that we do that, because I want to show it in an object lesson. We're going to role play that. We're going to play act how that would have been. They both spoke about the Torah, the law, and they both called it perfect. Both James and Paul call the law perfect. James actually says it's the law of liberty. The law equals liberty. While Paul in Galatians says the law equals love. And in talking about the law, they both summarize the law as love your neighbour. They both summarize it. James in his letter and Paul in Galatians, they both summarize it as love your neighbour. Isn't that amazing? They both so James emphasizes a living faith that leads to works, while Paul emphasizes that works cannot lead to living faith. They both give a midrash on Abraham. Now, midrash is basically a Jewish-style commentary on Abraham to draw out lessons on the life of Abraham. They both quote the exact same parts of Abraham's journey and use it to illustrate their points. They both opposed division in the church, dividing within the church. They both condemned boasting. They both taught responsibility for our fellow Christians. They both anticipated the soon return of Jesus. All within James and Galatians. Isn't that amazing? There's a lot there that is very similar. They just get to it in different ways. Now, coming back to the history of these people, they were both key people at the Council of Jerusalem. In fact, we're going to go through James, we're going to go through Galatians, and then we're going to do a couple of studies just on Acts chapter 15, where they all come together, because it kind of wraps the story of these two letters up to very nicely. We'll get to that around December time. They both were men of prayer. Now, in fact, James has several nicknames. He's called James the Just, but he has a very odd nickname that is preserved in the writings of Josephus. Does anyone know what that is? He was called James Camel Knees. James with the camel knees. It's because his knees were so callous from praying in the temple on the stony ground that he was called Camel Knees. Wouldn't you like to have that nickname? You know, that you're so calloused. I mean, we pray with a pillow sometimes, but he was on the bare stone floor, and his knees were calloused from praying. So that was a cool name that he had. They both died martyrs' deaths within a couple of years of each other, both in the 60s, under Nero, under the Roman, when Nero was in power. And James was killed by the people that he was taking the gospel to, the Jews, and Paul was killed by the people he was taking the gospel to, the Gentiles. Amazing symmetry there, isn't it? These guys are not opposed. They're the same gospel in two different manifestations. It's two sides of the same coin. But where people get a bit stuck is where it comes to this idea of faith and works. They both talk about faith and works, and they say what seems to be opposite things. Paul says that you cannot be saved with works, only by faith. We've read a few of those this morning, didn't we? In our Bible marking. And James says that faith without works is dead. This is the sticking point. This is the point at which Luther said, hang on a second, this is a problem here. But has anyone ever used a word that someone else is using in a very different way? Has anyone done that? I'll tell you a story from yesterday when I was at the funeral. And if you're watching later on, Bruce and Jane, it was actually in a discussion with you. So at the funeral, I met these guys, Bruce and Jane, who've been watching the videos because Phil and Bronwyn have both been sharing with them about Border Church. And in just discussion with them, Alina texted me. Alina sent me a text message with a receipt for some oil that because when we went and had spent her birthday down with my family in Brisbane, and I decided to service my car with my dad. And so Alina sent me the receipt while I was talking to them, and I just looked at it and put the phone away, and he's like, oh, who's that? Bruce, he's a bit of a character. And I said, oh, it's just my wife. He said, oh, just your wife? I said, no, it's not like that. She was just sending me a receipt because we just had a service the other day. And we'd just had a funeral service. So there's the connotation. And they're like, oh, sorry. I said, oh, no, it was a car service. Yeah. Okay, so the same word service had two contexts. You know, service as a funeral service and service as a car service. So the word faith and the word works can also have the same, different connotations of meaning. And I've got this little table I put together in this primer. So if you look at James, let's just go to James and have a look at James, because we all know how Paul uses faith. Paul uses faith throughout all of his letters in the sense of the thing that gets you saved. And he's basing it on that verse in Habakkuk, which he quotes very frequently, the just shall live by faith. Now, I don't think that Paul is using Habakkuk in a way that excludes James's idea of faith. But let's go to James chapter 2, in James chapter 2, and I've read James a few times as I've been looking and just seeing how it compares with Galatians. I've been reading the two of them back to back, and it speaks about, let me come to it. So James chapter 2, it's around verse 19. You believe there is one God, you do well. Even the demons believe and tremble. For James, faith he's using faith in a broader sense. Because even the demons have faith that God exists. They know, they can't deny it. He created them. They spent a lot of time around him when they were angels before they fell. So for James, faith is a cognitive acceptance of the existence of one God without necessitating trust and allegiance. So this is a faith that doesn't justify, is it? In James's view, he's not talking about faith within a context that faith justifies. It's just faith is belief. It's not belief plus trust. You can have faith with trust, but faith in the broadest sense is just belief. And even the demons believe, but they don't have trust, do they? So it's not a trust that... His idea of faith and belief is that it doesn't always lead to justification. Whereas Paul is using it in a more narrow sense of the faith which is trust in Jesus' work that gets you to salvation. So there's a difference in the way they're using faith, and there's a difference in the way they're using works. Because as you read James, works is not something that gets you saved. It's something that flows out of you naturally as you are saved. So I put down here, it's like a natural expression of faith working in the life of the believer through love. These works are the result and evidence of justification. And when Paul uses it in Galatians and Romans, works in his mind are the obligated behavior from either the Torah or the Jewish traditions that are added to Torah, which are seeking to elevate one to favor with God. So in Paul's understanding and use of the word works have no part to play in justification, because you can't do anything to get to be justified. And so they've both used works and faith in different ways. Can you see that? So they're not contradicting one another. They're just using the words differently, just like I use service differently to what was in their mind and should have been in my mind because we were just at a funeral. So service it's just one of those things. You can have different contexts. Isn't that fun? As we read through it, we're going to see that they're saying the same thing just through different expressions. Paul in Galatians, he speaks about the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience. He goes through the fruit of the Spirit. We'll get to that in chapter 5. And he says, against such things there is no law. But he doesn't say that the law is done away with. He's just saying that if you're living out the fruit of the law, then the law has no power over you. Very big key for Paul is whether you're under the law or whether you're not under the law. And that's what we'll go through. But for James, he's saying basically the same thing, that if you have the law of liberty and love abiding in you, you produce naturally the works of a changed life. And so they're both speaking into this situation of how do we express the gospel that Jesus has handed down to us only, just over 10 years ago. These letters come from within 10 years, within 15 years of Jesus ascending to heaven. So we're going to have a really good, fun journey through two letters. Any thoughts? That's the close. I just wanted. Are you excited? Are you excited for the next 6 months to go through these? What are your thoughts? Share some of what you love, or some questions or thoughts as you look at these two letters back to back.
I love that this is showing God's intention to save the entirety of humanity. Because one of this is focused to the Jews, yep, and one of this is focused to the Gentiles. The entire time God's intention has been to reach every person.
Yep.
And this is just another example.
On that, by the time James is writing, he's writing into communities that are mostly Jewish, but there were already people like Cornelius coming in.
Yeah.
And Paul is writing to communities in Galatia that would have had some Jews. So it's not all or nothing. One's writing to Jewish communities that have Gentiles there. Others are writing and Paul's writing to Gentiles communities with Jewish people there. So it's an integrating, the beginnings of the integration. Yeah, it's the beginnings of that integration which comes to a fruit in the Acts 15 council. Any other thoughts?
Once I was taught, I tried to do a theological Bible college.
Yes.
But the one thing I remember though doing Galatians, they said that they were very fickle, and they used to kind of stand at the top of the hill and see who was winning and join the winning side. Like, was there any truth in what I was taught?
That was one of the ways in which. So we have debates and we do them online, okay? And the way that people seem to win a debate is how many likes they get. How many likes or how much support they get. It's not much different to in the days of no social media in Galatia or in the Roman Empire, in the Greco-Roman Empire we talk about, Greco-Roman times. The idea of philosophy and of winning was something that they would debate in public, in the town square or in the amphitheatre. They would have debates over just whatever they wanted to, because this was how they would spar. They would spar with one another if they didn't have the bodies to be able to compete in the Olympics, of course. And so, or they didn't want to show off their naked bodies because the Olympics was naked back then. And so it was a more, it was a couth way of, it was not the uncouth way of just, getting sweaty and whatever. This was the sophisticated way. Sophistry, by the way, comes from the word sophos, which is Sophia, which means wisdom. It was the wisdom sparring. In fact, James, if you were to consider James a genre in the New Testament, it would be very close to Proverbs, because he's always talking about wisdom. This idea of wisdom flows through it. It's like the New Testament book of Proverbs, because he's speaking about wisdom and its application into the life of the believer. So yes, they would. There would be a couple of people battling, duking it out, and the people would pick their sides and then join to them, and just like on social media, like, yeah, that person's the winner. It's silly. Any other thoughts or questions? Great question, by the way.
So, to me, I'd never heard of this before, the two so similar. And to me, I was just thinking, it shows when you get two people and they're so similar that God's behind it all.
Amen.
So you can actually appreciate what the true writings are, because it's come from God.
Yeah.
And He wants us to know what's in the writings that we read.
Well, can you believe I typed, similarities between Paul and James on Google, and I tried to find parallels like this. I couldn't find a lot, because there's not a lot of people there's a lot more invested in showing the differences than the similarities. Now, they are similar, but they came from widely different backgrounds. James grew up in low socioeconomic Galilee with Jesus. Paul grew up in Tarsus, in the Roman Empire, and was educated by Gamaliel, by the highest of the highest people within the Jewish mindset. So God brings us, we talked about the Bible being the great equalizer. Grace is the equalizer. It brings us all into the same place where we need Jesus, and He transforms us. Yeah. I love these thoughts. I'm looking forward to getting into the...
I just love that you're doing both together.
Yeah.
Because generally it's one or the other.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I was like, I'll do something different with Galatians and James, because when they are done, they always have the other in the background anyway. If you do James, you're always discussing Paul and how he relates to Paul, and if you're doing Galatians, you're looking at how it relates to the people in Jerusalem, because James is mentioned in Galatians. So they're in the shadow. They're the shadow of each other, and so I just love that. And if you see my logo, I've done something clever with the number 2, where 2 2s make a love heart. So I've done something cute there, because you need the 2 of them to make the whole picture of grace. Well, let's have a prayer to close, and we'll ask the blessing over the food as well. Rotini, would you like to close for us? Pray. Oh, Elaine.
Heavenly Father, thank you for your word, thank you for all your promises, thank you for all the blessings that we get from you. And
Amen.